From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. The first person to interrogate Saddam Hussein after his capture, a former CIA senior analyst, takes us inside the debriefing of the former president of Iraq and then inside the White House dealing with a failed war and a Middle East spiraling out of control. That's all today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. John Nixon was a senior leadership analyst with the CIA from 1998 to 2011, did several tours in Iraq, and during his time with the CIA, regularly wrote for and briefed the most senior levels of the U.S. government, and that included President George W. Bush, Vice President Cheney. His first book, just out, Debriefing the President, the Interrogation of Saddam Hussein. Welcome, John. Honor to have you.
Well, thank you for having me.
And I'll say the book is mesmerizing, and I think you said this, but you're the only senior CIA analyst that have the axis of evil that you worked on Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, triple play.
Yeah, it was a triple threat.
All right, HVT number one, high-value target number one, Saddam Hussein. You were inside the room with him. To start off, tell us what the man was like.
Saddam was one of the most fascinating people I've ever met. He was extremely charismatic, and when we first met, I remember thinking he was charming, he was polite, he was well-mannered, witty, self-deprecating. I remember thinking, my God, do we have the right guy here? This is the butcher of Baghdad, but over time, as you got to know him, you got to see more layers of him, and you got to see sort of a darker side, and that was a person who could be really kind of nasty and arrogant and kind of vicious and certainly a little scary at times. And, he was kind of very filled with contradictions, and in a sense, he was very human.
How was it that he ended up alone? You describe, I think, 4 or 5 layers of security. He ends up leaving his sons and all by himself.
Yeah, well, he was on the run, and he sort of jettisoned his usual footprint that would tip people off as to who needed all these armed guards. And one of the really brilliant things he did on the eve of his leaving Baghdad was to sort of fire all of his regular bodyguards and replace them, sort of switch them out with new faces, people he trusted certainly, but people that weren't as well known to intelligence agencies that regularly looked at the people who surrounded him and who guarded him. And it worked for a while. But eventually, I think this group got tired of hiding him and life on the run, and they eventually found. I worked with special forces to find Saddam, and we eventually found this person who we really were targeting in terms of his access to Saddam, and he broke, and he led us to him.
What comes across in this book is just a degree of misjudgment we had about him. You talk about him being rather disengaged. Go through some of those misjudgments.
Oh, certainly. In the broad arc of his career and of his life and of the life of his regime, I think we got it right. He was a brutal dictator. But once I got to start talking with him on a regular basis, we started to get into this granular detail about him that really was surprising. And for example, that, as you mentioned, he, near the end of his time in office, he became very disengaged from running the government. He had turned over the running of the government on a day-to-day basis to his more senior aides and had really devoted a lot of his time and attention to writing a novel. And he loved writing and thought of himself as a writer. He was not the same Saddam as he was in the 1980s and the 1990s. He was older. He was a grandfather. He just wanted to do things that interested him now, and he wanted to, in a sense, a little bit retire from the day-to-day responsibility.
And interestingly, he was secular in nature in that he thought that the U.S. and Iraq should be on the same side fighting Islamic extremism.
Yeah, that was a real shocker. That was one of the areas where I think we really got him wrong, because we always looked at his relationship with the Sunni branch of Islam, his Sunni community, which was his power base. We always looked at this as sort of monolithic, that he was in control and that he was really in charge, and that he had basically co-opted this community, when in fact he was concerned that of the spread of Wahhabism and the spread of extremism that was emanating out of certain circles in Saudi Arabia and coming into Iraq and threatened to infect his power base. And he, despite the fact of being disengaged from governing, one of the things he always placed an emphasis on was regime security and his own personal security. And so he did remain engaged in terms of rooting these people out and making sure that they didn't threaten him. And yet he, on 9/11, he thought that, because the United States was so powerful and so wealthy and had so many smart people and the greatest universities in the world, that we would see that he was threatened by the same people who knocked down the Twin Towers, and that this would automatically lead the two countries, Iraq and the United States, to agree that we have a common foe.
And he told you that he knew the U.S. was not going to have a cakewalk.
He called it. He did not understand the United States, but he certainly had a far more developed understanding of his country, Iraq, and that's natural. But, he really understood his people. He said to me, you're going to fail here, and he said, you're going to fail because you don't understand the Arab world, you don't understand the Arab mind, you don't understand our history, you don't understand our culture, you don't understand our language, you don't understand us. And that's why you're going to fail.
So this is a guy that dumped chemical weapons on his own people with the Kurds ruled by fear. Did you come away still thinking we would have been better off not toppling him?
Well, the thing is, first of all, that is another area that we learned something. He had been accused of using chemical weapons, and his regime did use chemical weapons on the Kurds in 1988 in Halabja. However, one of the things I discovered was that Saddam actually did not give the order for that. That was a battlefield decision made by one of his generals. And actually, afterwards, Saddam had been upset. So I think that's, it's a kind of an equivocation, and people might say, well, they still use these weapons, but you have to understand that, it's not like, it's a layer of context that sort of complicates this whole thing about him being a mass murderer.
So did you ask him then, you didn't have WMD, why didn't you tell us so we didn't attack you?
We did. That's exactly what we said to him. And something, he said, but I did. I've been telling you for years that I don't have these things. And, and his response was, and how do you respond? But you don't believe me. And then you insist on weapons inspections, and Western intelligence agencies infiltrate their people into the inspection process. And then they're not only just looking for weapons, but they're also looking to document my military capabilities. They're looking to see the vulnerabilities of my regime, and giving this information to my enemies. And so, why do you think that I should? So, from his point of view, of course he would shut down the weapons inspection process, because it was never about weapons inspection. It was about getting him.
So even though
and to a certain degree, he's right.
So even though he's a Sunni guy, he feared extremist Sunnis. So do you think that he would have there would have been no ISIS with him staying?
I've talked about this. This is one of the most asked questions. And something, my answer is, and I've talked to this with experts, other experts in the field, and some have said, they would have challenged him anyway. And that might have been possible. But something, there is no doubt in my mind that if you have Saddam Hussein in power, the one thing he was really good at was keeping watch and keeping an eye on people who might get to him, and especially from within Iraq and his own people. I firmly believe that if he's in power, then the spread of Islamic extremism in the region is not really possible. And that he was sort of the bulwark against that. And when we removed him from power, it was like taking the manhole cover off the sewer.
Wow. We've got about 20 seconds left. clear up this big thing. How many Saddams were there? Were there body doubles all over the place?
The body doubles never existed. That's one of the most persistent myths about Saddam. There were no body doubles.
You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell over the Biz Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country, and you can go to biztalkradio.com, find the station closest to you, listen over the Internet, access our podcasts. We'll go inside the Bush administration's failed war next. And we're back with former CIA senior analyst John Nixon, written a mesmerizing book. Now we move inside the White House, and it's just as mesmerizing as inside the cell with Saddam. But I want to blow people's minds to start with. You actually compare Bush and Saddam and say they're alike in many ways. Tell us what you mean.
Very similar in outlook and personality, and I got the same feeling when I was just sitting in the room talking to them. It was kind of an eerie feeling. Both very imperious, very haughty, very arrogant in terms of leadership style, bombastic, had no experience with military, and yet turned to the military whenever there was a problem, and both thought of themselves as almost royalty. And
you say both gut risk takers.
Oh yeah.
And both screwed up two wars: Bush, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and Saddam, Iran, and Kuwait.
Yes.
I'm sure W would be happy to hear this analysis comparing him. So let's do a little after action in the White House. First off, did you fundamentally felt that there was a politicization of the CIA, feeding the president what he wanted, and you briefed him right face to face. Talk about that.
As far as politicization goes, this is a problem that it's not something that is experienced in the analytic trenches, which is where I was most of the time. Most analysts are trying to do the best job they can. It's just when your message starts making it up the chain of command, it starts getting watered down or changed, or sometimes the seventh floor where the leadership of the CIA sits changes the message because it fits more in with how they want to interact with the administration. So that's kind of the way that goes. Briefing President Bush, I had several sessions with President Bush and Vice President Cheney, and some were related. All were on Iraq. At times, President Bush could be very receptive, especially when it was good news and it was something he wanted to hear. But the minute you gave him something that conflicted with what someone else had told him, he became confused, and he would all of a sudden go back into this hunch and kind of go back to his gut feeling, and then it would be all of his preconceived ideas coming out. And what was really most fascinating about some of these sessions were one time I got into it with President Bush, and his entire national security team was in the Oval Office that day, and instead of after we disagreed, instead of trying to sort of hear me out and try to understand why there was a disagreement, instead they just all tried to attack me. And it was sort of they just started throwing darts at me and trying to sort of stump me. And it was the most uncomfortable 30 minutes I've ever had working in the government.
You can see why bad decisions were made. You make an interesting point, too, that Bush is smart, which a lot of people don't give him credit for, but very uncomfortable with multiple solutions when there's not like a simple black and white deal.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he was a big reader, and he read a lot of the raw traffic, and he was knowledgeable. And hey, after 8 years and 5 years of being at war, you should be. But the thing is, he just didn't know what to make of it. That's the problem where I think he got tripped up. He understood the information, which is a problem that a lot of analysts have. He understood the information, but he didn't know what it all meant. How
to put it together. One thing I've always worried about, and you kind of confirmed it here, which is I didn't think going into Iraq he had a good grasp of the Shia-Sunni split, and this was mentioned to him, and he responded something along the lines of, well, what, aren't they both Muslims?
Right, yeah.
That's kind of scary, wouldn't you say, to go into Iraq not knowing that?
Well, I think I mentioned also in the book how, in 2006 he was reading a book by David Fromkin called A Peace to End All Peace, which is about the making of the modern Middle East. I remember saying to a fellow analyst, I said, I wish he had read this book in 2002 and not 2006, because maybe it would have given him second thoughts.
Now, do you think that he competed with his dad? You're putting him on the sort of psychobabble for a while, and how that impacted him, and how do you feel comfortable doing that without real data?
I remember him saying something. The New York Times, there had been a book about him and his father the day before I met with him the first time, and he sort of made this face of like, oh, well, if you believe that nonsense in the New York Times. And I remember thinking that was kind of weird, but, he seemed, when you look at his father and you look at the relationship and you read all of the literature on the Bush family, you have to get a sense of this is very unusual. We've only had two father-son presidents, and you get a sense that there's a real competition. And I think that one of the things about George W. Bush is that he was always trying to prove himself and come out of his father's shadow. And his father was the last really great president, I think, in my opinion, last great president we had, and certainly the last president who understood intelligence and understood its strengths and its weaknesses and its uses.
And who did nuance.
Yes.
All right, now I want to move through these very quickly. Your impressions, sort of first thing to mind, Cheney.
A smart, bureaucratic player and somebody who kept his cards very close to the vest, and funny, witty, but a skilled, like you never knew what he was thinking, and just a skilled bureaucratic player.
Colin Powell.
A very decent man who found himself in a tank full of sharks.
And if he'd been listened to, we might have been all better off. Put it that way, right?
I think so.
Condi Rice.
Out of her depth.
As I find, too, that she didn't do the job, that she didn't provide the right options to Bush. She sort of mind-melded with him, gave him what he wanted.
She got chewed up alive by Rumsfeld and Cheney.
Wow. George Tenet.
A man with good intentions, but ultimately flew too close to the sun, and that's when the wax on his wings melted.
What about Rummy?
Rumsfeld?
Yeah.
He was not the biggest proponent of the war. And that's what a lot of people may find shocking, is that he wasn't a big fan of the war, but once we got in, he provided this strategy and this force structure that proved utterly stupid. Utterly stupid.
All right, tell us now as we get down to the last minute and a half or so, the CIA sort of takes the blame for this. You see a lot of mediocrity, risk aversion. What do we need to do to fix the CIA?
We have to stop the politicization in analysis. We have to get better at collecting information. And the president and his CIA director, and we also have to, it would be very good to sort of work the kinks out of the whole DNI-CIA relationship. The president has got to have the trust of the intelligence community, and the intelligence community has to have the trust of the president. And when you take the politics out of it, it can work. I remain an optimist in this case because, something, there is no alternative.
In a brief time, any answers for Iraq and Syria?
I think that the way it is now is going to be the way it is for the next couple of decades. This is not a success story, and all we can hope for is that maybe we might achieve some sort of stability and some peace and quiet. But it is a mess, and we have to do something about ISIS. And one of the places we start is you got to end the war in Syria, and also we have to get realistic about the Middle East. We have to accept the realities of the Middle East on the ground, such as Iran and Bashar al-Assad in Damascus.
Well, you certainly talk truth to power, and it is a mesmerizing book on both sides, Saddam and then on George W. Bush's reign. And it is called Debriefing the President, the Interrogation of Saddam Hussein. Thanks to John Nixon, you're listening to Business Talk with Jim King.